In the wake of his shooting in 1981, Reagan became more fatalistic than ever. He told New York's Terence Cardinal Cook and Mother Teresa that whatever time I have left belongs to God. More important, he believed it. No doubt FDR would have agreed. Their similarities do not end there. Each man had served as governor of the nation's largest state. Each entered the White House in a period of grave economic crisis. Each brilliantly used the mass media to enlist public support for his agenda. Successful presidents, I would suggest, are stage managers and screenwriters. They are narrators of their own drama, heroes of their own morality play. As the great communicator, President Reagan employed television to go over the heads of Congress and special interests, seeking to frustrate his efforts to reduce the size and cost of the federal establishment. Like Roosevelt, he raised the nation's mood through the force of his personality and unquenchable optimism. But it must also be said that he had a good deal more help than FDR could call upon. By the 1980s, the bully pulpit had been institutionalized, some would say trivialized, to include 3 people in the White House Office of Communication, 10 in the Office of Speechwriting and Research, 2 in the Office of Media Relations and Planning, 14 in the Office of Public Liaison, 3 in the Office of Public Affairs, 2 in the Office of Communication Planning, 14 in the Office of the Press Secretary, and 5 in the Office of News Summary and Audio Service. Under the circumstances, spontaneity went the way of rose garden ceremonies and focus groups. In his first run for the White House, FDR declared, "I ask you to judge me by the enemies I have made." This was more than shrewd. In truth, both Roosevelt and Reagan had a genius for exploiting their opponents, whether the European dictators against whom FDR maneuvered in the 1930s, or the evil empire that haunted Reagan's vision of a world precariously balanced on the narrow window ledge of nuclear destruction. On the home front, Roosevelt ran against big business. Reagan railed at the excesses of big government. Each man defeated a predecessor who knew considerably more than he did about the minutiae of government, and who understood far less about the American people. What Justice Holmes said of Herbert Hoover's successor in March 1933 seems equally applicable to Jimmy Carter's half a century later. Roosevelt declared the old Brahmin possessed a second-rate intellect, but a first-class temperament. Now, not even their greatest admirers would call Roosevelt or Reagan slaves to consistency. FDR entered office guaranteeing a 25% cut in federal expenditures, only to lay the foundation for the modern welfare state. There is, in fact, a wonderful story, which has the added advantage of being true, about in 1932, Roosevelt ran against Herbert Hoover from the left and the right, which was not difficult to do since Hoover wasn't very mobile. And in Pittsburgh, Roosevelt gave a famous speech demanding a 25% cut in all federal expenditures, denouncing Hoover as a spendthrift and a wastrel, and promising to do away with all sorts of unnecessary government boards and regulation. He wins the election. He governs successfully. He runs for re-election in 1936. Guess what? He's going back to Pittsburgh. His speechwriter, Sam Rosenman, comes up and says, "Mr. President, we have a problem." And FDR says, "What?" He says, "Remember that speech you gave in Pittsburgh in 1932? You promised a 25% cut in government spending." Needless to say, it was a promise that had not been kept. What should we do? FDR thought for a moment, and then he said, "I know, deny we were ever in Pittsburgh." With much the same cavalier attitude, Ronald Reagan believed he could cut taxes and grow his way out of the resulting deficit without sacrificing either his cherished military buildup or the social programs that even conservative voters wished to conserve for their children. Classic administrative theory held little appeal for either leader. FDR had 3 vice presidents. Reagan had 6 national security advisors. Early in his second term, Reagan casually allowed his White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Treasury to swap jobs, with disastrous results. At one point, the president joked about controlled chaos in his administration, claiming that its right hand didn't know what its far right hand was up to. For his part, FDR similarly welcomed the clash of ideas and personalities that went with duplication and overlapping responsibilities. In an effort to bolster farm prices, he cavalierly set the international price of gold each morning while breakfasting in bed on soft-boiled eggs. One day, he decided on a rise of 21 cents, telling his advisors that 3 times 7 was a lucky number. Other decisions had more fateful consequences. Roosevelt presided over the creation of the first atomic bomb. Reagan envisioned a strategic defense initiative, popularly dubbed Star Wars, to end the nuclear nightmare. FDR boldly recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. Reagan shocked the foreign policy establishment in 1982 by consigning the Marxist experiment to the ash heap of history. Roosevelt put the first woman in the cabinet. Reagan named the first woman to the Supreme Court. Each man was married to a controversial wife whose immersion in admirable causes was insufficient to overcome the fear and resentment she inspired among White House staffers. Roosevelt was the patrician with a common touch, Reagan every man with more than a touch of Hollywood glamour. Figures of elusive temperament, each was accustomed to being underestimated by his contemporaries. Of FDR, Walter Lippmann famously, if inaccurately, observed that he is, quote, a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president. Even harsher things were said about Ronald Reagan, whose presumed intellectual and ideological shortcomings earned him the mockery of one Washington opinion leader as an amiable dunce. More modest than the average politician, Reagan said he didn't mind the fawning media coverage accorded Mikhail Gorbachev after the Soviet leader conceded most of Reagan's points to obtain a nuclear arms deal. I don't resent his popularity, explained the president. Good Lord, I co-starred with Errol Flynn once. Beyond this, both presidents used humor as a shield and a weapon. As a presidential humorist, Ronald Reagan was in a class by himself. Who will ever forget the grace and wit he displayed in the aftermath of his shooting in 1981? The next day, Lynn Nofziger went to the president's sickbed and announced, "You'll be happy to know that the government is running normally." "What makes you think I'd be happy about that?" said Reagan. Famously genial, Reagan could actually be quite astringent in putting down a rival. For example, during the 1980 campaign, he claimed that Jimmy Carter was supposed to go on 60 Minutes to talk about his achievements, quote, but that would leave 59 minutes of dead air to fill. Reagan deflated his critics in the intelligentsia by describing a mythical costume ball attended by a friend who, quote, slapped some egg on his face and went as a liberal economist. Reagan's joy in political combat echoed that of his Democratic counterpart. In the 1936 election, FDR had a field day with so-called Me Too Republicans. Addressing a Democratic audience in New York that September, the president was at the top of his form. Quote, "Let me warn the nation against the smooth evasion which says, of course we believe all these things. We believe in Social Security. We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die, we believe in all these things. But we do not like the way the present administration is doing them. Just turn them over to us. We will do all of them. We will do more of them. We will do them better. And most important of all, the doing of them will not cost anybody anything." For each man, a landslide re-election was followed by a political comeuppance. Roosevelt's too clever by half plan to pack the Supreme Court with justices friendly to the New Deal demonstrated the limits of his normally faultless political judgment.